Utilitarianism, a guide to ethical decision-making. Utilitarianism is one of the most influential and widely debated ethical theories in philosophy. Developed by thinkers like Jeremy Bentham, John Stuart Mill, and later Henry Sidgwick, utilitarianism is a form of consequentialism, the ethical view that the moral worth of an action is determined by its consequences. Specifically, utilitarianism argues that the right action is the one that maximizes overall happiness or pleasure and minimizes pain or suffering. This video will explore the key concepts of utilitarianism, including the principle of utility, hedonism, the greatest happiness principle, act versus rule utilitarianism, and utilitarian decision-making. We will also look at examples to illustrate these ideas, explain the relevance of utilitarianism in everyday life, and examine some of the major criticisms raised against this ethical theory. The central idea of utilitarianism is the principle of utility, also known as the greatest happiness principle. This principle asserts that the morally right action is the one that produces the greatest amount of happiness, or pleasure, for the greatest number of people. Conversely, actions that produce pain or suffering are morally wrong. Utilitarianism takes a quantitative approach to ethics, measuring the outcomes of actions in terms of pleasure and pain. The origin of this concept can be traced back to Jeremy Bentham, who argued that humans are governed by two sovereign masters, pleasure and pain. Bentham famously wrote, "It is the greatest happiness of the greatest number that is the measure of right and wrong." Bentham, An Introduction to the Principles of Morals and Legislation. According to Bentham, all actions should be judged based on their capacity to produce happiness or prevent suffering. Key concept, principle of utility. The morally right action is the one that maximizes happiness and minimizes suffering for the greatest number of people. Quote, "The greatest happiness of the greatest number is the foundation of morals and legislation." Bentham, An Introduction to the Principles of Morals and Legislation. Example, imagine you are faced with the choice of spending a large sum of money on a luxury vacation for yourself or donating the money to a charity that helps feed thousands of hungry people. According to utilitarianism, the morally right choice would be to donate the money because it creates more overall happiness by benefiting many more people than a vacation would. Relevance for everyday life. The principle of utility is relevant in ethical decision-making at both the personal and societal levels. Individuals can apply it when making decisions about charity, consumer choices, or relationships, while governments and policymakers often use utilitarian thinking when crafting laws or public policies aimed at maximizing social welfare. Criticism. A major criticism of the principle of utility is that it can sometimes justify immoral actions if they result in greater happiness overall. For example, if harming one person brings happiness to many, utilitarianism could theoretically justify this harm, raising concerns about justice and individual rights. Utilitarianism is often grounded in hedonism, the view that pleasure is the only intrinsic good, and pain is the only intrinsic bad. This idea holds that the ultimate goal of human action is to achieve as much pleasure or happiness as possible while minimizing pain. Bentham's version of utilitarianism was explicitly hedonistic, as he believed that all human actions are motivated by the pursuit of pleasure and the avoidance of pain. However, John Stuart Mill introduced a more sophisticated version of hedonism by distinguishing between higher and lower pleasures. Mill argued that not all pleasures are of equal value. Intellectual, moral, and artistic pleasures are qualitatively superior to mere physical pleasures. Mill's view is sometimes called qualitative hedonism, in contrast to Bentham's quantitative hedonism, which treats all pleasures as equal in value. Key concept, hedonism. The belief that pleasure is the only thing that is intrinsically good, and pain is the only thing that is intrinsically bad. Quote, "It is better to be a human being dissatisfied than a pig satisfied, better to be Socrates dissatisfied than a fool satisfied." Mill, Utilitarianism. This reflects Mill's view that higher pleasures, such as intellectual fulfillment, are more valuable than lower pleasures, like physical enjoyment. Consider two activities: reading a challenging book or watching a mindless TV show. According to Mill's utilitarianism, reading the book might produce higher quality pleasure because it engages the mind and promotes intellectual growth, even if the TV show provides immediate physical enjoyment. Relevance for everyday life. The idea that happiness is the ultimate goal is reflected in how people pursue pleasure and avoid pain in everyday life. Hedonistic considerations often shape personal decisions about lifestyle, leisure activities, and relationships, as well as broader societal values around well-being and quality of life. Criticism. Critics argue that hedonism is too narrow and simplistic because it focuses exclusively on pleasure and pain, ignoring other values like justice, freedom, or virtue. Some also question whether pleasure is always a good thing, pointing to examples like sadistic or unhealthy pleasures. Utilitarianism is often divided into two main types: act utilitarianism and rule utilitarianism. Both forms agree that the goal of morality is to maximize happiness, but they differ in how this principle should be applied. Act utilitarianism maintains that each individual action should be evaluated based on its specific consequences. In each situation, the morally right action is the one that directly produces the greatest happiness. This approach focuses on the immediate outcomes of individual decisions. In contrast, rule utilitarianism argues that we should follow rules that generally lead to the greatest happiness when followed over time. Rule utilitarians believe that we should adopt moral rules, such as do not lie or keep promises, because these rules, when consistently applied, tend to promote the most happiness. Rule utilitarianism thus emphasizes long-term consequences and the importance of maintaining stable, trustworthy moral rules. Key concept: act versus rule utilitarianism. Act utilitarianism evaluates each action individually based on its consequences, while rule utilitarianism evaluates actions based on their conformity to rules that generally maximize happiness. Quote, "The utilitarian morality does recognize in human beings the power of sacrificing their own greatest good for the good of others." Mill, Utilitarianism. This suggests that rule utilitarianism can accommodate principles like altruism and self-sacrifice. Example: suppose lying to your friend would spare their feelings and bring happiness in a specific situation, act utilitarianism. However, if everyone lied whenever it seemed to promote happiness, trust would erode, leading to overall unhappiness, rule utilitarianism. Rule utilitarianism would argue that you should tell the truth because following the rule do not lie generally produces better long-term consequences. Relevance for everyday life. The distinction between act and rule utilitarianism is useful in making ethical decisions. Act utilitarianism may be appealing in personal situations where specific consequences are clear, but rule utilitarianism offers a guide for adhering to general moral principles in more complex, long-term scenarios, such as in professional ethics, politics, and law. Criticism: act utilitarianism is often criticized for leading to morally questionable actions in certain situations, for example, lying or breaking promises, if those actions produce the greatest immediate happiness. Rule utilitarianism, on the other hand, may be criticized for being too rigid or rule-bound, potentially ignoring the specific context or consequences of individual cases. Utilitarianism offers a systematic approach to ethical decision-making, known as the hedonic calculus, developed by Bentham. The calculus is a method for quantifying the amount of pleasure and pain produced by an action. Bentham suggested that we could measure the utility of an action by considering factors such as 1. Intensity: how strong is the pleasure or pain? 2. Duration: how long will the pleasure or pain last? 3. Certainty: how likely is it that the pleasure or pain will occur? 4. Proximity: how soon will the pleasure or pain happen? 5. Fecundity: will the action lead to more pleasure or pain in the future? 6. Purity: will the pleasure be mixed with pain or free of it? 7. Extent: how many people will be affected by the pleasure or pain? Although Bentham's calculus aimed for a mathematical approach to ethics, utilitarians generally acknowledge that it is impossible to precisely calculate happiness. However, The calculus provides a useful framework for thinking about the consequences of our actions and comparing different ethical options. Key concept: hedonic calculus. A method for calculating the overall happiness or utility of an action by evaluating its potential consequences across several dimensions. Quote, "Nature has placed mankind under the governance of two sovereign masters, pain and pleasure." Bentham, An Introduction to the Principles of Morals and Legislation. Suppose a government is deciding whether to build a new park or a new hospital. The hedonic calculus would involve weighing factors such as the number of people who would enjoy the park, extent, the intensity of the pleasure it brings, and the long-term health benefits provided by the hospital. Relevance for everyday life. Utilitarian decision-making is commonly applied in policy-making, business ethics, and medical ethics, where decisions often require considering how to maximize overall happiness or welfare. For example, in public health decisions, utilitarianism may guide choices about resource allocation to ensure the greatest benefit for the greatest number. Criticism. Critics argue that the hedonic calculus oversimplifies moral decision-making by reducing it to a numbers game. It can be difficult or impossible to measure subjective experiences like pleasure and pain with precision. Additionally, the focus on consequences may neglect important moral principles, such as justice or human rights. Despite its widespread influence, utilitarianism has faced significant criticisms from philosophers and ethicists. One of the primary concerns is that utilitarianism may sacrifice individual rights for the sake of the greater good. By focusing solely on the consequences of actions, utilitarianism could justify morally troubling actions if they maximize overall happiness. For example, imprisoning an innocent person might be seen as acceptable under ACT utilitarianism if doing so would prevent greater harm and maintain social order. This raises concerns about justice and fair treatment. Critics like Immanuel Kant and John Rawls argue that utilitarianism fails to respect the dignity of individuals and does not adequately protect minority rights. Key concept: critique of utilitarianism. Utilitarianism can sometimes justify actions that are unjust or violate individual rights in the pursuit of the greater good. Quote, "The rights secured by justice are not subject to political bargaining or to the calculus of social interests." Rawls, A Theory of Justice. Rawls criticizes utilitarianism for not respecting individual rights as inviolable. Imagine a scenario where torturing a suspected terrorist could prevent a major attack and save lives. Utilitarianism might justify torture if it produces the greatest overall happiness by preventing the attack. However, many people would find this morally unacceptable because it violates the rights and dignity of the individual. Relevance for everyday life. Utilitarianism's emphasis on the greater good is often invoked in policy debates, such as those surrounding surveillance, vaccination programs, or climate change, where the interests of the majority may conflict with individual rights or freedoms. Critics remind us to be cautious of sacrificing moral principles like justice or fairness for the sake of aggregate welfare. Criticism. Critics argue that utilitarianism is too impersonal, overlooking moral obligations to individuals and potentially allowing moral atrocities if they benefit the majority. Additionally, the focus on happiness can lead to debates about what happiness means and whether it is the most important moral value. Utilitarianism is a powerful and influential ethical theory that evaluates the morality of actions based on their consequences for overall happiness. Through key concepts like the principle of utility, hedonism, and the hedonic calculus, utilitarianism offers a framework for thinking about moral decisions in terms of their impact on human well-being. However, it has been criticized for its potential to justify injustice or sacrifice individual rights for the greater good. Whether in personal ethics, public policy, or global issues, utilitarianism remains a relevant and often debated approach to moral philosophy.